Hi everyone, I wanted to talk about an article that I found quite interesting. I came across quite recently, and it's written by Mary Harrington, and the title is Incels Could Become the New Vikings, and it's an issue, or a topic I should say, that I thought would be perhaps interesting to kind of my viewers, considering I've wrote kind of in the past, I've released videos in the past about the incel movement. It's currently a topic that I'm researching as well, so I thought it'd be quite interesting. So just to jump straight in to the article, it reads, "Last week, World War III nearly started in Ladakh, a dry, high-altitude region of Indian Kashmir on the Himalayan border with China. It's been the site of escalating tensions and military build-up for some time. On June 15th, the first physical confrontation between the Indian and Chinese militaries for 45 years erupted, killing at least 20 Indians and 45 Chinese soldiers. There are all sorts of geopolitical reasons cited for the escalating tension between the world's two most populous countries, but there is one more central and timeless problem that is going to drive both countries towards violence and instability: women, or a lack of them." So it's, I guess, kind of it's a kind of an idea you see a lot kind of brought up in the manosphere, or by people that are maybe adjacent kind of to the manosphere. Kind of, so I'm thinking like people like David Buss, Jordan Peterson, who's kind of became persona non grata at this point. Louise Perry also, I think, recently just released a book called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. And it's kind of this idea that polygamous societies tend to be much more inefficient, less productive, more violent, and there's a lot of kind of internal strife often between kind of wives as they kind of co-parent for children and so on. And obviously, as you can imagine, if there's multiple wives and mothers in a kind of family unit, there's obviously going to be a clash of all sorts of personality styles, of parenting styles, and so on. So it gets to this idea that basically what happens if you have a polygamous society where, as we see in many other animal species, that the alpha male, usually the strongest, most socially adept of the male kind of members of that species, they rise to the top of some dominance hierarchy, to use a Jordan Peterson term, that when they reach the top of the dominance hierarchy through exuding some sort of excellence or capability, they're then afforded a bounty of material resources that everyone below them in the social order doesn't receive. So they have first access to food, water, to mates, I guess, is most saliently, and then everyone else is left to proverbially feed on the scraps, so to speak. And again, we see that, again, in the case of like people like David Buss, who argues that if a society tends too far towards hypergamy, that is where, essentially, in this particular case, where the alpha males of the species dominate the kind of all sexual interactions, where a small sliver of the male species makes up the majority, or the vast majority of all sexual interactions. You then create, basically, to some extent, what we see the kind of now the incel problem, where you have this pool, this underclass of men that feel no real reason to buy into the tribe, the group, the society, because they don't feel like they have any access to dating opportunities, to mates, to X, Y, and Z variable or value that people might aspire to. And if these people, so there's another term that kind of Jordan Peterson kind of was pilloried, if I can say that word properly, for using enforced monogamy, where you have a society that's kind of aimed towards the ideal of marriage or of long-term monogamous relationships. And what happens basically if you just resort to a hypergamous, polygamous society? And I think to some extent we're probably going to find that out. So to continue on, in his History of the Normans, written circa 115 AD, Dudo of St. Quentin, I think if that's how you pronounce it, argued that the reason the Vikings went raiding was because they couldn't find wives, an idea echoed by the Tudor antiquarian William Camden in his 1610 book Britannia. Vikings, Camden suggested, were what you got when there wasn't enough women to go round, resulting in an excess of young men hanging around full of machismo but without any prospect of finding a nice girl and settling down. Viking literally means raider. So, whenever these spare males multiplied themselves to a burdensome community, Camden reports that an area would draw lots. Those of the young troublemakers chosen in the lottery would be sent off on a ship to make a nuisance of themselves overseas, which they did. In evolutionary biology, the operational sex ratio is a term used to count the proportion of males and females in a given species that are seeking a reproductive mate. As soon as the ratio tilts away from 50-50, the sex that's overrepresented will have to compete to secure a mate from among the less plentiful potential partners of the opposite sex. Slightly, maybe I'm doing us a disservice, but maybe a slightly clunky way of phrasing that. So basically, if there's many more men than women in a society, then women are in a far greater demand. Each individual woman in the dating market is in a far greater demand than the average man. So women get to decide the terms of engagement, basically. And actually the last point is quite interesting. So the Vikings kind of drawing a lottery to decide who of the young men would go off and raid and fight. And it brings up a kind of an interesting phenomenon. So in psychology there's I think it's a term called young male syndrome. This kind of idea that young men, adolescents, young adults, specifically men, are highly aggressive. They're much more likely to commit violence than the rest of the population. They are more status seeking, so they're looking to a greater extent to improve their social standing among others, their peers, and society in general. And they're also typically more risk taking, again probably due to elevated levels of testosterone, the lack of a fully developed frontal cortex, among probably many other reasons. And it's interesting, as a society, what do you do with the young male syndrome, with young men? And then kind of in the Viking society, you could send them off. They would have some social utility. But what happens when there isn't an obvious social role for this class of disaffected, potentially violent and risk-taking, status-seeking men? And I think to some extent you see it now in society, that with men kind of going their own way, the manosphere, kind of in general, kind of this idea of kind of growing polygamy, that a polygamous society could very well be efficient for those at the very top of the social order, but how do you get people at the bottom of the social order? Incels, for example, or hikikomori, as I've spoke about in other videos, how do you get them to buy into society when they perhaps feel that society doesn't offer them the same level of goods, or I guess goods, or I guess they don't quite seem to realise the dream that society puts forward. What do you do when people feel disconnected from the dream of society, whether it be the American dream or whatever? So to continue on, in evolutionary biology, the operational sex ratio is a term used to count the proportion of males and females in a given species that are seeking a reproductive mate. As soon as the ratio tilts away from 50-50, the sex that's overrepresented will have to compete and secure a mate from the less plentiful potential partners of the opposite sex. Yeah, basically. Supply and demand. If there's many more men than women, then the average man is not worth as much as the average woman, because there's a far greater quantity, so there's going to be less proportionate demand. And So they get to decide the terms of engagement, basically. And to continue on, though they wouldn't have used the phrase, both Dudo of St. Quentin and William Camden were both describing this phenomenon in human males, where potentially wives are scarce and the burdensome community of spare men multiplies. The result is more violence and crime, as I've mentioned before. One 2019 study showed that where polygyny, I always forget the difference between polygyny and polygamy, that is, multiple wives is a social norm for higher status men, attacks on neighbouring ethnic groups skyrocket. With a few men monopolising eligible women, as I mentioned, the rest are forced to seek status and resources by attacking other tribes. India and China both have an extremely burdensome community of spare males, born boys to girls, is around 105 to 100, but Ismara, I'm going to butcher this name, Ismara Hizvetendal documents an unnatural selection thanks to prenatal ultrasound and sex-selective abortion. The ratio in China is around 118 to 100 and 108 to 100 in India. In some regions of India, the ratio rises as high as 150 males to 100 females. Though sex-selective technology is now banned in India, it's still widespread, and the country now has some 37 million more men than women. Studies estimate that China has around 30 million excess men. So again, that sounds like a nightmare, a demographic nightmare. So that feeds into just so many different problems. So, I mean, not only kind of this idea of kind of young male syndrome, but when you have such an imbalance between the sexes, how will that affect the fertility rate and everything else that goes along with that? Social care, who will look after the elderly if there's far fewer children per individual and they have less people to rely on, their family units are much smaller. But to continue on, a naive view of mate competition might imagine this would play to women's advantage. Females in sexually dimorphic species don't choose mates at random but select for traits that will give their offspring an advantage of some kind. In bird terms, that might translate into choosing the male who can build the most splendid nest. Humans, being evolved creatures, do this too. Hypergamy, or more colloquially, marrying up, in practice means that the wealthier a man is, more women will consider him a desirable partner. Which makes sense. You want to prioritise, you want the greatest return on your investment, basically, especially for a woman where sex represents a much greater risk, where they have a finite number of eggs, they have a limited number of children that they can potentially conceive, so they need to maximise basically their return on every pregnancy they can to ensure its survival, and they do that by selecting for those that offer the greatest prospect of security, of abundance, being able to provide and protect, and so on. And so it says, certainly some women benefit. Hypergamy in China is brutal. Young Chinese men in some areas pay a deposit to a woman's family, even for the right to date her. Non-refundable if the match doesn't work out. Women refuse anyone who doesn't have a car, a house, and money for a bride price running to tens of thousands of pounds. Fucking hell. Right, that's insane. But other women pay the cost. Human rights organisations have reported the ugly side effects of the women shortage, which includes skyrocketing sexual harassment in India and bride trafficking in China. There, women are tricked into migrating from countries such as Cambodia or Vietnam before being locked in a room and repeatedly raped until they are pregnant. Sometimes these women are allowed to escape but must leave their child behind. And, I mean, apart from that just being absolutely fucking dismal, it's, again, if you're being analytical, you can understand how an increasing demand for an ever diminishing quantity of a valued resource leads to more nefarious and desperate attempts to secure that resource. Or in other words, you now have this swelling underclass of men that desperately desire sex and intimacy, and they'll get it by any means necessary. Again, not to excuse the kind of that conduct, but if we're trying to understand it, kind of in the spirit of this article, it continues on to say, along With a hidden cost in abused and trafficked women, Chinese history suggests that bachelors with no prospect of marriage are associated with banditry, violence, and even civil war. The Nian Rebellion of 1863 was driven by bare branches, as men with no prospect of marriage are called in China. Meanwhile, in India, social scientist Prem Chowdhury expects the woman shortage to make politics more extreme, as a man with no family is considered worthless and will need to prove himself somehow. If they remain single, they will be declared not men at all. Historically, a common solution to the problem of bare branches has been to divert them from domestic troublemaking to foreign expansionist warfare. The Viking raids on Britain were one result of this. So was the conquest of Quito. João I of Portugal, the illegitimate son of King Peter I, came to power with the help of their own variety of bare branches in 1385. But when he realised that their privacy and robbery posed risks to his own rule, he sent them off to seek status and resources by invading North Africa instead, kicking off a long and ugly history of European colonialism on that continent, the repercussions of which still echo today. So yeah, again, I'm not sure if the article mentions this, but yeah, it's quite well established in kind of in the terrorism literature that terrorist groups like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and even to some extent maybe more extreme groups in the manosphere, they obviously seek to target those that have low self-esteem, a low sense of value, a low sense of significance in society, and they are very receptive to this kind of idea of a mission, of a purpose, of waging war against some perceived enemy, an enemy that they usually consider to be the source of their own grievances. So again, it makes complete sense that really since kind of time immemorial that this is the makeup of those that join extreme military conflicts or terrorist kind of movements and so on. To continue on, so I'm not suggesting all the tensions between India and China can be attributed to sperm. Ladakh is close to the headwaters of the Ganges, not a location India wants to see under Chinese control, but unlike Dark Age Scandinavia or medieval Portugal, modern nations can't just send their spare men off to expansionist wars, although there are reports that China is using Uyghur women like Viking men would have used captured Saxons. And men who cannot demonstrate their masculine worth by forming and supporting a family will look for other opportunities to prove themselves. The prospect of two nuclear-armed superpowers squaring up with a political climate shaped by angry young men should worry us. And I think that's quite interesting. So Mary Harrington writes that they will try and demonstrate their masculine worth by forming... Oh no, sorry, that's the wrong one. Is that the right one? Right, I've lost it now, but they basically said that they're going to try and prove themselves. If they can't prove themselves by having a woman through more traditional means of showing success, then they'll look for alternative kind of forms of success or means to success. So there's a Marxist theorist called Robert K. Merton, and he came up with a theory called strain theory. And again, it's very similar to this, that if people can't attain what mainstream society deems valuable, you know, white picket fence, a house, a partner, a high status job, a nice car, they'll then turn to crime or some alternative means to try and achieve this level of status. So if they can't get it kind of for legitimate means, they'll look for illegitimate means to attain those kind of socially vaunted values. And again, as we see here, it's very similar. That if you don't deal with this kind of class of people that feel disaffected and don't feel like they can attain what society values through legitimate means, then you're going to see a huge spike in crime and other extreme behaviours and activities. So it's something that should interest everyone in society, because if you don't care about problems like these, they'll come back to haunt you in the future. But people, for whatever reason, seem to be very squeamish talking about issues like this. But regardless. So it continues on to say, angry incels closer to home should worry us too. Tempting though it may be to imagine that in the West progressive values have somehow abolished our evolved tendencies to intrasexual and intersexual competition for the best mates, evidence suggests otherwise. Although the sex ratio in liberated West is the normal 105 to 100, today this isn't translating straightforwardly into family formation. As women have become more educated and economically independent, research hoped hypergamy would fade away, with women becoming more willing to marry down. It would make sense, after all. A woman doing well and a demanding career might in theory have an easier life if she married a self-employed plasterer whose flexible schedule would let him deal with school runs and appointments. And again, yeah, if you believe the social theory that really this kind of idea from the Enlightenment forwards that we can somehow escape our base deficits, that we can live beyond our animalistic instincts, it just isn't true. It's just people are attracted to what they've been attracted to for tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, or even millions of years when you consider kind of our hominid history. You don't overwrite genetic code in a couple of decades, and it's a kind of mistake that we seem to be making repeatedly. And this is why you see so many companies like Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. Like, as soon as you understand some basic principles in evolutionary psychology, it doesn't matter how intelligent you are or how progressive society is. We operate and function according to many kind of limitations. That's kind of the... So there's a kind of a point that Tristan Harris, the ethicist of kind of artificial intelligence, he makes that artificial intelligence isn't... We shouldn't necessarily worry about artificial intelligence when it can outwit the smartest among us. We should worry when artificial intelligence is smart enough to capitalise on our greatest cognitive weaknesses, which it already has. People end up addicted to social media, to porn, to drugs, because they stimulate this limbic kind of reward centre. And this is, again, trying not to get too far away from the point, but you can't overwrite these instincts so easily. They're much more difficult to mould and to augment than perhaps we'd like to admit. But to continue on, but after hundreds of thousands of years of evolving to prioritise mates with resources and status, it seems that many women still prefer to seek the best potential partner. One recent US study showed that even where women are more educated than their partners, they will still show a preference for men who earn more than them. That is, high-flying women will disregard a plasterer and pursue an equally high-earning husband. To compound the problem, social norms in favour of monogamous marriage have loosened over the decades since the 1960s, but this hasn't made women less choosy about their partners. The number of American men under 30 who have never had sex tripled between 2008 and 2018, but hasn't risen nearly as rapidly for women. The only plausible explanation is that women are still having sex, but they're competing for a smaller pool of desirable men and leaving the rest on the shelf. If I remember the stat right, that in 2008 around 18% of men reported not having sex, I think it was, since they turned 18. So it's between 18 to 30 years old. So, and I think it was maybe 2018, maybe 10 years later, that had risen to 28% of men. So 28% of men aged between 18 and 30 hadn't had sex since they turned 18, which is probably a good kind of proximate value for how many virgins there are in society. And for women, I can't remember off by hand, but I think it only risen by maybe a few percent, maybe 3 or 4% in that same time period. So you only have to look at online dating advice for American men to see this at work. Show her you aren't an average video game playing, cheap beer drinking, couch potato loser she wants to avoid, advises one article on cultivating the alpha male persona. So even with normal sex ratios, our culture is creating a sort of flotsam of sexual no-hopers, composed of those males who simply aren't impressive enough to attract anyone even for a fling, let alone a committed relationship. The grievances of this sexual underclass are creeping into our politics, as Angela Nagle argued in Kill All Normies. Sexual patterns that have emerged because of the decline of monogamy have seen a greater level of sexual choice for an elite of men and a growing celibacy among a large male population at the bottom of the pecking order. Their own anxiety and anger about their low-ranking status in this hierarchy is precisely what has produced their hardline rhetoric about asserting hierarchy in the world politically when it comes to women and non-whites. Sorry, just seen how much got left to go, so it's nearly finished. So it says, in case anyone is tempted to dismiss this as harmless losers posting misogynistic memes, remember incels go on actual killing sprees, and there's considerable overlap between the red pill community of sexually frustrated anti-feminists and the far right more generally, as in the Nain uprising bare branches make for ugly politics. Bare branches also make for enthusiastic terrorists, a point I mentioned just previously. So ISIS used sexual slavery as a key plank in its recruiting pitch for foreign fighters. Like the Vikings, men don't have many prospects at home and will take considerable risks if they think it will get them laid. And again, like the actual Vikings, never mind whether the girls are willing or not. Conversely, settling down de-radicalises. According to research by the Institute of Family Studies, people with children are less likely to express views consistent with white identity politics. Likewise, the Saudi Arabian de-radicalisation programme essentially involved getting extremists married and has proved very effective. It's difficult to tackle this subject without getting yourself accused of being red-pilled or a men's rights activist, but surely it's possible to discuss the political and social problem of spare men without believing that the solution is to force unwilling women to have kids with them. And addressing this problem should absolutely be seen as a feminist project. Being consigned to a life of hopeless, low-status singledom makes men more violent, sexually dangerous and politically disruptive. This is not an excuse, but it is a reality. It's straightforwardly in women's interest to improve the lot of our own burgeoning plague of Vikings. Yeah, I would have to say I agree with pretty much all of that. Again, I don't know if it should expressly be seen as a feminist project, but again, taking it in a kind of to be kind of more charitable to our interpretation, I do think it's an issue that affects everyone to one degree or another, so it should be seen as a larger societal issue. Maybe not just simply as a feminist kind of project, but it kind of goes to the very core of our social order. If you have an underclass of people that just don't buy into that social order. And it's kind of a point that the article makes more generally, that you have to find a way for people to buy into society if you want them to be productive members. And this is something I don't feel like we've got right, really, as a society. Like, what is it that's supposed to inspire these people that see no hope in the world? If so many of the things that they might want, love, romance, intimacy, sex, a family, a sense of significance, that they're valuable, that they have a community around them that they can be there for and that can be there for them, then yeah, I think in many ways it's quite obvious to see why we have this kind of growing incel problem. Because you need to offer some sort of dream, you need to extend an olive branch to these people. And not to leave it too pessimistic, I know, you need to be able to offer them a reason to take part in your society. And I just think without derailing it any further, we also live in a society where there's just, I don't know how to explain articulately, but there's a moral blindness to anyone that's a white, cis, heterosexual male, which I'm sure will go down well and probably get me cancelled on YouTube, but there's a moral apathy for some reason for anyone that is deemed to be privileged or to be historically at the top of the social order. It's as if these people just can't suffer and we're just blind to their suffering. But in a more optimistic note, if people realise that we're all very interdependent, and that if you don't look out for the lot of men, then this will affect women as well. This will affect everyone. Society will crumble. You can't leave any group to feel disenfranchised and dejected, because it will take everyone down to some extent. But I'll shut up because I've rambled a lot. Again, if you've liked this video, if you like this sort of content, then please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and again, I'd greatly appreciate it. So I think I should have released a Patreon by the time you watch this video. So if you can offer any contributions at all to the Patreon, I'd greatly appreciate it, because it basically allows me to make more content and to focus on kind of issues like this. And without your contributions, again, I wouldn't be able to make this content. So I greatly appreciate your time, support, and your kindness. Thank you for watching.